So today we'll be going over the Cyber Guide for Cyber Savvy. Today I will be going over the current trends and the current legislation of cybercrime. So the trends will be real-life examples, threats, malicious techniques, and changes in professional techniques. As for legislation, I will be giving a brief description as to what it is and a critique of the issues that are present in the current legislation, as well as the potential omissions of the current legislation, so what's left out, and the potential ethical threats that one might face when dealing with the current legislation. Let's go over the current trends in cybercrime. First, we'll be going over the Morris worm, which was made by Robert Morris and was released on the 2nd of November 1988. It was spread around using email and targeted Unix software. Of the many casualties were places like NASA, Harvard, and Princeton. After discovering that he had lost control of the worm, he tried to warn people, but thanks to his worm, very few people had actually received the warning. So, in an attempt to fix the problem, people tried a wide array of things, from restarting their whole networks to just isolating their devices. However, when he was eventually caught, he was put under trial through the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986. And as punishment, he was sentenced to a fine, probation, and an order of 400 hours of community service. This would be an example of a DDoS attack. Now I would like to talk about the Vastamo hack of 2020. So Vastamo is a therapy company which had announced on the 21st of October 2020 that they had been hacked by a famed Finnish hacker whose name I cannot pronounce. What the hacker tried to do was blackmail Vastamo into paying him a fee to not release the data that he had captured from their databanks about their patients and what they had told their therapists. However, Vastamo had denied his request, after which he had targeted the patients, sending them all private emails telling them to pay a certain fee or else he would release their data. It was confirmed that at least one person had committed suicide after hearing his offer, and but however, it didn't really matter if anyone did pay his fee because he had already released it on his own private server. However, because he published the information on his own server, it was easy to file a case and prosecute him, which resulted in a sentence of 6 years and 3 months. Vastamo was also fined with the failure to protect their own customer data. This would be an example of ransomware, as the information was held back unless they paid a certain fee to get it back. So today we'll be talking about the threats that would be faced in the 1990s. So the very first polymorphic virus was introduced. So a polymorphic virus is a piece of code that mutates while keeping the original piece intact to avoid any form of detection. An example of this would be the very first virus called the 12 was known as the 1260 or the V2PX. It was meant to serve as a warning to any internet users, although it ended up doing quite the opposite and inspired a bunch of criminals to do whatever they had wanted. Another thing would be the disk killer virus. What would happen is it would lay dormant until it would reach a trigger date, which was often March the 6th. It would overwrite critical system sectors and potentially cause any significant forms of data loss. After these large events, the EICAR was introduced, which is the European Institute for Computer Antivirus Research, which, as you can tell, researched how to fight against these antivirus. This was researched how to fight against these viruses and just how to fix them. Some more recent hacks were the hacking of celebrity social media accounts, which was used to promote people's bitcoins for people to transfer money to. So they would hack into popular accounts like Apple, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Kanye West, and many other names, and they would advertise their own Bitcoin numbers, telling people to invest and give them more Bitcoin, because Bitcoin was famously hard to trace. Another example would be the Marriott hack, which had approximately 5.2 million hotel guest data being taken from them, and the company actually ended up receiving a £14.8 million fine for allowing the data breach to happen. Another famous one would be Zoom, where the accounts of 500,000 users were leaked, including personal details such as their date of birth, address, names, and that's just one of many things that Zoom has got issues with. So to conclude this slide, most 1990s viruses slash attacks were done on accident and weren't intended to be attacks, whereas recently they've been more targeted with a more malicious intent, which would often be greed. Now we will be going over the malicious techniques that hackers would have used. So this one will be going over the brain virus of 1986. So this was a virus that went worldwide through the use of floppy disks and was invented by the Alvey brothers. It was designed for the IBM personal computer and was intended to prevent any form of copyright infringement by popping up a message saying to call the brothers to receive a vaccination of sorts, which is what would remove the message that would pop up. So the Alvey brothers started receiving calls from all over the US and then branched out to all over the world to the point where they ended up DDoSing themselves and the plan backfired. The contemporary one is about Costa Rica, which as of 2022 was the first country to ever declare a national state of emergency after having a cyber attack. What happened was a Russian-based gang called the Conti. They had first attacked the finance ministry and had even affected civilian import-export businesses. Next thing they did was target the nation's healthcare system and took that offline. As a result of this, the US offered millions in bounties for members of the Conti gang. However, none were really released. The Conti urged civilians to get their government to pay and tell Costa Rica to pay the fine of $20 million. The Conti had stated, "We are determined to overthrow the government by means of a cyber attack. We have already shown you all the strength and power." So that shows that they were being really serious, showing that they would do it. And after having their quote, they had actually leaked the files online because the country had refused to pay the fee. And what had happened was a ransomware analyst had checked to see if the data was real, if it was actual Costa Rica files, and it matched. So to conclude, the historical attacks were much more physical, as everything was hard to connect everything wirelessly, so they had to plug something in and that would do the damage. Whereas nowadays we have more online ways of attacking through the internet as everyone's more connected online. Now we will be going over the changes in professional techniques. So one of the very first things introduced was firewalls, but they only became much more commonplace after the Morris worm incident. So what firewalls do is they act as security barriers that monitor and control network traffic based on preset rules, preventing unauthorized access and protecting against any form of potential threats. However, nowadays we have more serious issues which caused most people to adopt a zero-trust security policy as of 2020. The traditional perimeter-based approach is what most people go with, so that would be like firewalls, intrusion detection, antivirus software, the basics. So together they work to monitor and filter network traffic, identify potential threats, and prevent any unauthorized access to the network. However, what zero trust security is it assumes that no one can be trusted with anything unless absolutely necessary. So after security protocols are set up, nobody ever touches them again, so that nobody else can see that they have a way in. Now we will be going over the current legislation in cybercrime. There are four main categories when it comes to the current legislation. There is Computer Misuse and Cybercrime Acts. There are data protection and privacy laws, cyberbullying and online harassment legislation, and social media and online platform regulation. So to start with Computer Misuse and Cyber Acts, This covers the unauthorized access to computer systems, which results in things like data theft, hacking, other malicious activities. They also address offenses related to things like malware, DDoS attacks, and cyber terrorism. Data protection and privacy laws, however, include things like the General Data Protection Regulations, or GDPR, and regulates how organizations can collect, process, and protect any form of personal data, and often includes penalties in a case of any data breaches or mishandlings of data, which could result in the fine of that said company. Cyberbullying and online harassment legislations are, well, they cover things like cyberstalking and revenge porn, and often outline penalties for any offenders. Social media and online platform regulations aim at dealing with things like fake news, hate speech, and disinformation campaigns. However, companies can also make their own rules on top of these. There are many more examples, but those are much more niche scenarios like things like crypto and international law, which at this point in time are irrelevant. However, there are many flaws in the current legislation, so it can be very vague, so it can be unclear as to what constitutes as a crime or not. Is simply entry into a device unlawful, or do you have to actually take something? Will be one of those examples. It can also change depending on where you are, so each country has their own laws, and all you have to do is go abroad and make the crime from somewhere else. You can go from China to the UK, and there will be a lot of hassle as to how you can be prosecuted, as you're not actually in the UK, so you can't be prosecuted under UK law. So there's also the issue of privacy regarding law enforcement and what they can access with and without a warrant, and what could be claimed as evidence in the crime and what can't. There's also the issue of how future proof it is, as the world's technology is constantly evolving and new forms of crime can come along to wreak havoc on what we class as basic crimes. Some of the potential omissions of current legislation, there's many different forms that it could take. Some of these could be cyber extortion and ransomware, or it could be things like cyber awareness and education. So, for cyber extortion and ransomware, there may be a need to strengthen penalties for cyber extortion and provide clearer frameworks for how to actually respond to that for law enforcement, including whether they should make payments or not and reporting whatever is required. It is also important to remember the awareness and education about anything cyber related, as it's still relatively new, dating back around 30, 40, 50 years. So there is a need to educate the young about the possible issues as cybercrime is increasing and is becoming much more common in today's world. The potential ethical threats of current legislation. So there are four main ethical dilemmas: privacy concerns, the inadequate protection of vulnerable groups / discriminatory enforcement, extraterritorial jurisdiction / transparency and accountability, and the impact on innovation and security research. So, privacy concerns. So, this may involve extreme monitoring of any sort of online activities and could potentially infringe on a person's right to privacy. So, if you're using like a work computer and your employer can see your search history. The ethical question here is, where do we draw the line between security and privacy? Inadequate protection of vulnerable groups / discriminatory enforcement. So there is a risk that it could be enforced in a discriminatory manner, targeting certain groups or communities disproportionately. So where do we draw the line between fairness / justice and prejudice? Some legislations might not protect vulnerable groups such as children or the elderly from threats like cyberbullying, fraud, or even exploitation. The question here is, do we let these groups take care of themselves, or do we intervene and take extra precautions for our children and our parents? Extraterritorial jurisdiction / transparency and accountability. So this creates challenge for international cooperation in fighting cybercrime. So we need the world to come together as to what can be classed as cybercrime and how to combat against it. However, there is the question of how it would be overseen. So Would it be overseen by an independent, maybe international body, or a form of public scrutiny? The impact on innovation and security research means that it could restrict certain online activities or pieces of technology in the name of cybersecurity and may slow down any innovation or impede on legitimate security research. So, when do we gain the right to study and research the tools of the darker side of cybercrime, so viruses and the works? I would like to thank you all for listening, and this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.